Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this next session of the Square One Roundtable. I'm Jeremy Travis, and pleased to be with you, and pleased to welcome people back after a remarkable discussion last night. Our theme for this meeting of the Roundtable, which is spread over 3 days, is to explore the value of values, the ways in which we aspire to and operationalize certain values for the workings of our approach to harm, our approach to restoration, our approach to accountability. What are the values that we would like to ensure are guideposts to that work in the future and the work we do today and our personal commitment to this work? So it's been a great discussion so far, rich beyond our wildest dreams. And today is a continuation of that very deep, sometimes very personal, very emotional exploration of this question of values. So I'd like to just quickly go over the agenda that we have for today, just to make sure that we're all oriented and grounded in the journey ahead. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so, half hour, reflecting on last night's presentation and discussion, conversation really between Marl Peterson and Daryl Atkinson, which was so thought-provoking and so timely and so lively. It's great to see them interact with each other. They gave us a lot to think about. That was very, very salient as we think about the question of values. And as we move into this larger discussion that we're going to have today about the tension between the abolition aspirations and the question, what is an irreducible minimum, as to what role the state should play or our response should look like for these issues that are so complex. So in many ways, last night was a great pivot. So we'll have this discussion for just to reflect on that a bit, and then we have 3 of our colleagues have written blog posts that have been distributed beforehand. We'll ask them to summarize those, their observations, their contributions. Each one of them is sort of stands on its own, and together they're a very powerful mix. So we'll hear from Marcia and Jonathan and John, Simon, and Aneka. And then we'll, about 10 minutes to the hour or so, we'll go into breakout rooms with the magic of Zoom that can do this for us. We don't even have to think about it, and we'll end up with colleagues who we get to spend some more time together in a smaller setting. And in each of those, there's been one of our colleagues who's been designated to listen carefully and take careful notes of the conversation, report it back to the larger group. And there's a Square One staff person assigned to each breakout session, who will also be listening with that goal in mind, make sure that we capture everything that happens in those discussions. Just speaking personally, I really treasured the time that we had in the small breakout sessions last week. It was really a good way to interact on it in a different modality. This is a large screen. It's almost a sort of formalistic conversation, even though it gets to be very lively, but it's really great to have those highly informal small group discussions. So then after the breakout reports, we will take a break at 3:30 Eastern time for a grand total of 15 minutes. We're really generous with time here. 15 minutes, we know that it's probably more than you need, but we'll ask you to come back at 3:45. And then Catherine will take over, and what a treat we have in store for us and here in the Roundtable, and for those who get to watch this on YouTube. Danielle Allen, who's been a participant in the Square One discussions that we had on the social contract, and wrote a paper for that roundtable meeting. She will be interviewed by Catherine about some of her thoughts on values and the role of values, and what are the guiding principles that we should keep in mind as we reimagine justice. So that'll be discussion that we will participate in, but we'll also hear the back and forth between Catherine and Danielle, which will be great. And then about 5:45 Eastern time, we'll ask Bruce Weston to do that which he does so well, which is to help make sense out of the journey that we've traveled throughout the day. So tomorrow is our final day of the roundtable writ large with a capital R. It's also the final day of this roundtable session, and we'll talk about. I'm sorry, not tomorrow, next week, and we'll talk about what is ahead as we wrap it up. So that's where we're headed. And we're going to start with some reflections on the discussion last night between Marlon and Daryl. And as I said, I found it to be just a perfect table setting for today, in part because they teed up the issue of abolition versus, as we're using the phrase, irreducible minimum, just perfectly for us. But they also thought about the role of values. And you'll recall that Daryl at one point had this nice riff where he talked about moving from should to must to shall. So here's what we should do. There's an urgency. Here's what we must do. And then there's this commitment. Here's what we shall do. So that, I think that captured some of our feeling within the Square One team and network that we want to not just be aspirational, but actually commit to change. Big discussion last night also about this question about, in the way that Marlon phrased it, was, is the state equipped to follow the values that we might aspire to in our should, must, shall progression? And a great discussion that was really should be highlighted, I think, on racialized capitalism, just naming that and having that be foregrounded as an impediment. Can the state, can the system, can what's been created in this country ever aspire to the values that we might hold out? And at one point, Daryl said, "I just don't see it. I actually don't see this being possible." In his sort of deeper reflections about whether that could be created in the society, particularly for communities of color. But at the same time, there was this discussion that went back and forth about how do we think about restoration? How do we think about reconciliation? How do we think about some of the values as being operationalized in the moment or at a community level? Marlon talked about what he called sort of the root exploration of the roots, ROTS, going deep to see what's behind conflict, what's behind problems, and not simply reacting to what happens in the moment. So who does that work? How is that work done, if that's important work to be done? So there was a lot of ground covered last night, and I'll end with something that I found, again, particularly insightful from Daryl, which was, he talked about the underutilized muscles, the underdeveloped muscles in the movement. And I think that's what for me, that's what the Square One project has been about, is to sort of, what are the muscles that we need? What are the muscles that are underdeveloped? The way he framed it was, what are we for? And that's the pivot to today's discussion about operationalizing values. So I would just ask anybody who would like to offer their reflections on our discussion last night, and we'll then 12:30 or so tee up Marcia to be very direct about some of her thoughts. And for this purpose, please also use the blue hand signal that you would like to be called upon, and we'll spend some time getting your reflections on last night. And for those of you who couldn't make it last night, I just encourage you to find it on YouTube. It was a really, really spectacular discussion.
I think Monica has her hand raised, Jeremy.
There we go. And now I see it. Yes, Monica, and then Courtney. Thanks. Thanks, Catherine.
So, I mean, I think I share in just really finding the conversation last night to have been provocative and important. And one of the things that stood out to me, I guess, I kind of come away from that conversation, and particularly basically I don't want to call it a debate, but I'll say a difference on pessimism and where that takes us versus abolitionism and where that takes us is like, you know, the kind of how do we get from here to wherever we're going, or how to motivate work here right now, given that there's not a plan to take us all out of here right now. So how to sustain labor, if that's one's view, I think is just something that, you know, I have certainly been thinking about especially in terms of abolition. You know, how possible, I guess, do you have to think actual full-on abolition is in order to work toward it in the here and now? So, yeah, additional thought.
Great. Thanks. Courtney, your thoughts from last night?
So it was such a great conversation and so much to take away from it. But for some reason, I kept really thinking about the value of forgiveness and how is forgiveness tied to abolitionist work? And is there, can we garner enough forgiveness to really get to where we're trying to go? I just think about this in terms of I guess we're doing this live. So for people who are unaware, my father was incarcerated when I was 6 months old, spent 10 years in prison, and our path to forgiveness took 20 years. And this is someone who I am intimately connected to. And so what does that mean if we say that we have a value of forgiveness? It is, who are we forgiving? How are we forgiving? And what is the journey towards forgiveness? And how do we sustain the labor in forgiving? So that sort of kept coming up for me as I thought about abolitionist approaches.
Yeah, I think the mention, the focus on forgiveness as a value really struck a chord. And I noticed in the group that gathered after we sort of went off camera, that some of our colleagues just said, that's the hardest one for me personally. And even if it is a value, and recognizing what you said, Courtney, that the question is, how do you hold that, and for how long, and what does that journey look like? Is that still the aspiration? And to state that aspiration is, for some people, just very difficult. I was also impressed that was given so much attention last night. John.
It was an amazing conversation. I didn't know either Marlon or Daryl well beforehand, but I'm certainly going to plunge into their written and spoken word. I found it, I put it in the chat, a sort of Du Boisian moment. I mean, I kept thinking of W.E.B. Du Bois, that deep commitment to American struggle and history, but also recognition that maybe we just need to leave, as Daryl put it at some point. And Du Bois ended his life in Ghana, I believe. And I've often, I mean, Bruce will attest to this. I mean, sociology has belatedly discovered Du Bois as its founder. And I don't think he was being taught, or Monica was even being taught as part of the canon in your sociology theory class. Now we've decided and I think the great book by Alden Morris on Scholar Denied certainly lays a foundation for it. But his notion of double consciousness was very much on my mind when I was listening to Marlon and Daryl, because the power of being able to see the possibilities, but also the realities of the white vision, or the whiteness as a veil over your lived reality, and the harm that does, but also the power from that vision was definitely present last night.
Yeah, there was a great chat contribution last night, John. I appreciate it. Very, very thought-provoking and good historical reference. Donna?
Do I take my own hand down there?
It should happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also was thinking a lot about forgiveness or redemption. And I don't think that there is going to be like a single definition of this that we converge upon. I also don't think that it is static. I think it's dynamic. Even as we, maybe come to a closer to a shared understanding of what that looks like. I think that also changes, like depending on a lot of different circumstances. And I think that what is really fundamental to like operationalizing that is to just be in continuous conversation with the stakeholders. That is just, I think, the fundamental thing we have to be doing, because it's not something that we can be prescriptive about, I don't think, right? Like as this country changes in its demography, like I think as a lot of things change, right? As technology changes us, like as a lot of things are in flux, I don't think we can be super prescriptive about what that looks like. But I think what we can be prescriptive about is that it has to be inclusive. It has to be continuous. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for that. And last night, you also referenced, Donna, which I appreciated, the importance of inclusion of immigrant communities in the larger coalition as having a different but very real experience with marginalization and oppression. Part of that conversation is very much underway, I think. So we need to keep that in mind as well. Bruce?
I'd like to sort of pose a question to the group about, what do we think forgiveness should look like? And so, one model I think of is South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process, and the ground rules of that process is that people from the apartheid regime, individuals from the apartheid regime, would appear before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they would give a full accounting of what they did, and all of the harms that they perpetrated. And they were significantly immunized from any of the acts, any of the violence that they perpetrated. And in a sense, that was a type of forgiveness, right? In exchange for truth. They would be immunized. So that's one kind of model, and so they had an active role in that too. They had to come forward to the Truth and Reconciliation process and make a full accounting of what they did. So forgiveness doesn't depend just on the aggrieved party. It also depends a lot on the responsible party as well. So what would we think a process would look like? I think we've got some clues, right? I think Susan Glisson in an earlier meeting is, she reminds us that these are often importantly local processes that in which we're talking about the harms that have been confronted by specific communities in specific times and places and so on. And so I sort of put that to the group, if we were to get more granular and concrete, what sort of forgiveness process do we feel like could be a foundation for more foundational change?
Bruce, and just to back that up one step, there's a question of what sort of acknowledgement of harm is required before you can even have that subsequent conversation. So you don't move to forgiveness right away, right? There has to be some and I think this is what Donna was saying, and Courtney as well. There has to be some process. There has to be some engagement.
Absolutely.
Between the parties. So you referenced a state-sponsored engagement that becomes individualized, and that's one model we can think about. But certainly forgiveness at an individual level requires some acknowledgement of harm, and we've seen that a bit. Chris, you're up next.
Thank you. Just in response to Bruce's question, and then reflecting on last night, two things that were very meaningful to me were, first of all, I think it was Bruce who raised that connection may be the antidote to violence. And in addition to that, I think the statement was also made that banishment is not forgiveness. And I think that forgiveness includes validation. I think it includes hard work. It includes relationship, community, and restoration for both the individual who may have made a mistake, but also for the survivor. And so it's I just don't think that forgiveness, I think it is absolutely a process, Jeremy, as you say, but I think it includes all of those elements, and ultimately it ends probably in community.
Monica, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm really intrigued about the conversation about forgiveness, but I want to sort of ask in a clarifying way, forgiveness for what? Like, because I actually think the specific things, the specific issues would require different types of processes for forgiveness. So it seems like implicit, I think, in a lot of our conversation is about, like, you know, is imagining particular sorts of infractions, like individuals, like interpersonal violence or something like that. But when I'm thinking about forgiveness, at least right now, I'm thinking about structural violence and
Right.
violence. And but then also think, I mean, if you want to take it back to individuals, I think the types of forgiveness structures we might need in an anti-carceral way for certain types of white collar crimes, those create certain types of harms, and the strategies for forgiveness would have to be different. I think at the very least, so to take it back to that like idea of the truth and reconciliation, people acknowledging the harm they've created is one piece of things. But of course, the earlier piece is hearing about those harms from people who have been affected by them in a deep way. Because one of the problems, like in the American reparations conversation, for example, is like all kinds of harms that have been exacted by multiple systems of racial injustice. And it's hard for people, it's hard for people to really understand them in the moment, like what the full nature of harm. But beyond that, like, I guess there's like, to me, it's hard to have a conversation about forgiveness. I guess this is what I'm saying. It's hard for me to have a conversation about forgiveness if, because to have that be foregrounded when it seems like a big part of thinking about forgiveness, once we move past what I think the level is we're like imagining, is deep repair, is like actual, not just accountability, but restoration of people to and communities to their previous or like, you know, would be otherwise state.
Right. I mean, depends on the harm that we're talking about, and that then determines the steps, the many steps that have to be taken before forgiveness can even be discussed. So we have two folks who would like to make some observations. I'll call in Nicole and then Susan, and then unless there's somebody else who has what we call the urgent wave, where there's one more thing you want to say in forgiveness, because we can continue this and should continue this. So with thanks to Courtney for highlighting that from last night, let me ask Nicole to say a few things, and then Susan, and then we'll switch gears and talk to our bloggers.
I just this idea of forgiveness, in my first thought, for some people, it sounded like they were talking about reentry. So if you create harm, are you welcomed back to society and what would it take? But I was actually thinking of it totally the opposite, which is, how does George Floyd's family forgive Chauvin, but also the institution that created Chauvin? And my issue with, saying we got to work with stakeholders is that most stakeholders will not admit the types of violence that they engage in, and they actively hide it. And so how do we heal from that, and how do we reform from that? And again, I know this firsthand by, my work in jails and, working with a supposed reformer jailer like Tom Dart, and, where you're constantly, it's almost like getting gaslit, where you say there's this type of abuse going on, and no, it's not, you don't know what you've seen, you don't know what you heard, you're like, well, I got it on tape, I have someone talking about this abuse. And so how do you heal when the person won't acknowledge the harm they've done? And it almost reminds me of like domestic violence, like admit you're wrong, admit you're wrong, admit you're wrong. And it's the abuser is the one saying that, and they never will own the violence that they're perpetrating. And so I think about the police torture ring for John Burge that happened in Chicago. The reparations there was not about money. It was about education and having a narrative that set the record straight about what happened and how the Chicago police tortured over 130 people and did it over 30 years. The biggest resistance to reparations in the city came from policing families that did not want their children to learn about the curriculum, the torture curriculum. And it shows that truth is a very powerful tool. You cannot have forgiveness and therefore empowerment without allowing the stories to be told and heard, so the trauma can be put somewhere, right? So people get a dignity reinstated. And therein lies the puzzle, which is the perpetrators and then those extended from them do not want those stories to be right. And yet the onus feels like it's those who are disempowered by the system for them to forgive. But yet I think if we're talking about stakeholders, I mean, the word stakeholders means you have a stake. You are holding on to a stake in the existing system that's creating the violence. So I think that really, to me, is the big centerpiece. How do we change that portion? And that is very difficult.
I see a multi-year square one project emerging here, which is, what does truth and reconciliation look like in this country? And I'm serious about that. I think that could be another undertaking. Susan Glisson, and then we'll switch gears.
Thanks, Jeremy. My apologies to everyone for being late. I had a home emergency, but I'm glad to be with everybody. And I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to the really important insights that y'all are offering. I would just lift up the work of Pumla Gobodo-Madi Kazela, who was the clinical psychologist for the TRC. She wrote, many of y'all know this work, A Human Being Died That Night. She spent, after the TRC was over, a number of visits with, I believe his name was DeCoke. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. He was the head of the secret police, who enforced a lot of the extra legal measures, violence that was meted out. And so she's grappling with the idea of remorse as integral to these processes. And I think that's something that's worth talking about. What Monica lifted up really resonated with me. In our work in Mississippi, nobody brings up forgiveness as it relates to structural issues, except in the need sometimes, as we have seen it, for the titular leader of a system, right? So the chancellor of the University of Mississippi, even though he wasn't alive when the policy of excluding African Americans from the university began at its beginning in 1848, nevertheless, he occupied the position of power that represented that institution. And it was important as the representative of that institution to acknowledge what happened, to not deny it. but also for us to say that's not enough. If you don't go about measures to repair the damage that you've done, then an apology is just words on a page. The only time forgiveness comes up in the conversations that we have been a part of with community leaders is one-on-one, which then is particular to the individuals in that case. And I'm thinking of Alistair Little in Northern Ireland, who went to jail at the age of 16 or 17 for killing someone during the Troubles. And he doesn't feel he ever has the right to ask for forgiveness from the family of his victim. So it's going to be particular, I think, to each place. And it's going to be messy, and it's going to be hard. And the folks who caused the harm are going to have to dig deep, and they probably don't have the muscle memory to do that. So they're going to have to learn. And it's difficult to have to ask folks who have been harmed to be patient while that happens for the person, you know, as they've been harmed. So my favorite definition of this sort of restorative justice as a kind of umbrella concept within which forgiveness might be a component is Theo Smith's from Emory. He says that for him, restorative justice is the ability to restore justice to restore dignity rather to the perpetrator and the victim. What does that look like for each case? So thanks for the opportunity to say a few words.
Well, thanks go to you, Susan, for those words and for your work on this topic, which is just so exciting. I think those of us who are with you in Durham will remember vividly your contribution at the end of our time together there about your work. And it was a perfect capstone to that meeting of the Roundtable. And once again, the perfect ending here. So, dear friends, we're going to switch gears and we're going to do the following. We're going to ask our three colleagues who have each written a blog post to spend a few minutes, not many, 3 to 5 is what they've been asked to do. We'll see how well we can keep to that, to summarize what it is that they have put into that writing. And just remembering that we're now thinking about moving towards this living in the tension. We love to live in the tension here at Square One. And this tension is between abolition and what we call the irreducible minimum. And each of our colleagues has written, not precisely on that topic, but in ways that shed light on that discussion. So we'll hear from each of them, and we'll have a group discussion after their presentations, and we'll do them back to back so we can get a lot of ideas into the air, and then we'll move into our breakout rooms. So our first up is Marcia Gallardo, and the floor is yours.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So to start off, I just want to first, I don't have sage or cedar or copal. I'm in a totally different space, but I want to acknowledge the original people of the land. I'm in Chumash land, and but wherever you are, you know, just acknowledging the original peoples of that land. And then I have to start by also just kind of reintroducing myself. My name is Marcia Rincon Gallardo. My spirit name is Tlacapantzin. And it took me all the way till almost being 60 years old to be able to have a traditional ceremony with one of our elders who's 90 to actually name me according to our traditional ways. And I start first by, so, you know, I'll be brief, by saying that we have these ceremonial practices that, you know, and it's different for all tribes and nations and indigenous peoples. But there's this process where when we go to an all-night ceremony, from the time we walk in, let's say 8:00 p.m. till midnight, we're asked to to spill out, put out in front of the sacred fire, in front of our sacred instruments, in front of our loved ones and relatives, to share what it is that hurts us. And we have people, there's usually what people call the sponsor, who's sitting in the spot, the revered spot, to actually be there so that we can intentionally pray for them and for the purpose for which we were brought to pray for them for. And it could be a happy moment, like a graduation, a birthday, or it could be a very sad moment, someone who passed, or someone's very sick, or somebody was wronged. So up till midnight is the time that we speak about those things. And then from midnight forward, we are to think about the things that we want, those things that, and we have to visualize it and say it as if it has occurred. And that is how we are taught. So I tried to use that same format for writing this paper, this blog, in the sense of trying my best to articulate what has happened in the past in order so that we could then think about what it is we need into the future. And there's a lot of reconciling that needs to happen, right? In fact, that was the purpose of the paper, was to say, wait a minute, there's too much pain and too much hurt from this particular system. And actually we go all the way back. We don't go back just to the 1600s. We have to go all the way back, because this land, we were here. This is Anahuac, right? This is Abianahuac. It's not America. America was named by the Spaniards, America, right? And so even the comment last night, maybe we have to leave America. No, this is our homeland. This is our homeland. And we are connected and tied to it. And so if we are connected and tied to this land, that we are connected and tied to everything, you know, whether they be the mountains, whether they be the air, it's a very different paradigm and way of thinking. That then how do we use what was given to us ancestrally to then take care of those things, to then move forward. So it's important then to reckon and to be able to state what were the first prisons. We're trying our hardest to show that our ancestors and the original people didn't use prisons, didn't use structures of 4 walls. We're trying to make sure, you know, research-wise, to be able to say, no, our ancestors never even used cages, right? Because we were successful in being able to handle offenses, and there were restorative practices. Even the truth and reconciliation, there's peacemaking. This land has developed those processes, and to honor the peoples of this land, we go back to those. We always go back to and ask, what did our ancestors do? We always go back in order to then go forward. And so in the reconciliation or the reckoning part of it is to acknowledge how did our people respond to offenses or misbehavior, to then be able to say, okay, and then the white man came with their values, and we're very clear about those values, those Puritan values, especially on the youth side, the youth justice side, that they came with values about children being born of sin, and that you had to beat the sin out of them. And so that punishment-oriented process, unlike our ancestors, right, who felt and showed in their actions that children were born sacred, that life was sacred. And the worst response we could give to someone was to banish them, right? To embarrass them, to put them away, keep them away from us. But that was the worst. And so when we think about what was done, and then think about then these structurally racist systems already in motion, structures that put us in, how could I say this? Placed us in situations where we had no power to be able to respond in the sense of, wait a minute, these are not our values. And so if they're not our values, then we have to, we're being, what's the word I want to use here? How to end pre-existing structured injustice. It's like, it's taken us a minute to be able to respond and sit in our power, to be able to say, wait a minute, we already have ways of responding. And so then given that, what is it that we need to, place forward? We talk a lot about not just ending, but what are the solutions? So we go back to our original, we go back to people who have already been sitting in these systems to say to them, okay, what has been your experience? And from your experience, then what is it that we need to be doing differently? And so we hear from them, and we know that it's a one size fits all, that as original peoples from this land, we know that we're still invisible. There's the statistical genocide that happens to us still. We're completely invisible. And so it's, if we're invisible, then two things happen. There's no resources that come to us, and there is no representation of our people sitting and in policy discussions to even acknowledge that we have solutions. So in this paper, and so I'll begin to close, is I wanted to reflect the paradigm shift of what are values. And I'm not being, this isn't, you know, I think that it's important. We recognize that peoples from all over this land are so diverse that it's important to listen to the voices of all the people from this land in order to develop the more important values. But there are some values, such as being humble, such as, you know, the ones written in the report, that we honor virtues of honesty and humbleness and integrity, that it isn't just about money, right? That being a benefit to society where success and wealth and a rich life is not measured just by money. And when we think also about redemption, it's not necessarily, it's pulling in on spirit and the healing. There was a discussion about forgiveness. And I think that we also have to recognize that when we believe and feel spirit and have done our healing, that then there's solutions, that the right solutions will come. And I think that there's a lot of people on this land that have lots of already thought up solutions that we need to go to. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'll be open for any discussion regarding the blog.
Thanks, Marcia. Just a perfect way to start. Sort of the biggest frame possible in some ways. We'll turn next to John Simon for your thoughts, and then to be followed by Aneka.
Well, I'm honored to follow Marcia, and just to bridge, I'm sitting on the unceded land of the Ohlone people here in Alameda County, California. And I have to say that, you know, you can't begin to even seek forgiveness until you know that you're part of the problem. And I've lived in California in various ways for decades. And when I moved out here in '77, partly to get away from the Chicago police, who you can see followed me anyway, I loved California and felt this enormous sense of satisfaction in being an American who could just move to California at 18 and enjoy its universities and its fabled parks. And Mendocino County might have been my favorite spot in the whole place. It's got the famous wildflower covered, you know, cliffs along the ocean with whales going by. Well, it's also the site of maybe the greatest massacre of Native people to be conducted in California during the white settler period in 1859. About 1,000 natives were killed by a death squad that was literally paid out of the state budget because the U.S. cavalry wouldn't do what they wanted them to do in terms of And I don't know that there's even a marker up there right now. So our whole landscape is littered with such sites. And I don't, when we talk about redemption or forgiveness, we would have to do a lot of work to unearth that. Let me quickly move to a couple of themes from my piece. So first of all, it's an amazing time to talk about values. I know the arc of this wasn't planned to take place during a global pandemic and a reckoning with racial justice after the murder of George Floyd, but what a time to think about values. There's a reason that I think every time in American history that there's been any leap in values, it's usually followed a big bloodshed event of some sort. And there's something about a lot of death that makes the living more plastic in their ability to imagine different institutions or different values, and to revalue our values, to revisit our values. I thought it was really telling on the first day or last week that we wanted to have a discussion about values, but it became a discussion about politics, as I think Jeremy and Bruce have both put it. But I mean, that's exactly right? I mean, the only values we should care about are values that actually get experienced as part of politics, or as I would call it, looking backwards, history. One of my teachers, Philip Selznick, always talked about values, yes, but values in the world, in the factory, in the New Deal, in various historical moments of struggle. And I think what happens is that the only way you come to know values is through a moment of political upheaval in which those values are suddenly, as Bruce put it last week, sort of become a motivation for people to take extraordinary risks and to do extraordinary things. And I've mostly been a witness to that from comfortable spots, but like I posed the image of Hegel watching Napoleon ride by, which was apparently an apocryphal moment in any event. These moments when social movements are transforming our society tend to be the moments, and I think they're particularly Black movements that have, for American society, triggered these revaluation of values. So very quickly, today I see the Black Lives Matter movement as, while in some ways it's a continuation of an abolition movement that goes back to enslavement, it's also a distinctive historical realization of that, and it's bringing two values to the fore, that many values, but the ones I'd hold out are human dignity and anti-violence. And the reason I think they're interesting to think about those two values is that when you asked me to think about the irreducible minimum, I kind of like that because it accepted that abolition is the right horizon, and then the question is like, well, what values ought to anchor our sense of what we want left, or what we want after we transform the system as much as we can. And it seems to me that while it's the Black Lives Matter movement that's bringing abolition to the fore right now, it's also bringing the irreducible minimum to the fore, which is, to me, anti-violence. So very briefly, a word about each. Abolition, to me, is just about human dignity. Whenever somebody says, well, we need to abolish that, what they're saying is there's something about that just is incompatible with human dignity. And we might disagree, right? I mean, there are people who deeply believe that abortion is just not compatible with human dignity. And I respect their belief in that, even though I don't share it. But there are many things on which we can agree, as George Floyd's murder showed, in terms of what is inhumanity and what human dignity requires. So when you're talking about abolishing something, whether it's ICE or the police or tenured faculty positions, you're asking whether, or capitalism, you're asking whether that practice is capable of being reformed enough that it's can fit with human dignity. And I hear the Black Lives Matter movement saying our current criminal legal system is incompatible with human dignity. It's not just that it murders people with some regularity, Black people, but actually on a daily basis, it's humiliating to people. And humiliation is in some ways more than death, the kind of ground of indignity, or, we know dignity when it's denied us, right? So we know dignity when we're humiliated. And the carceral state, I mean, from courtroom to jail to prison to police car, I mean, show me the place where there's not humiliation, and I'll say, well, let's start there. Maybe there's something we can reform, but there's so much humiliation built into the system. So it often seems that the alternative, well, we don't want that humiliation, let's change things, but what about violence? Anti-violence in some ways is a late fruit of our society. As David Slansky shows in a recent book, sort of the law doesn't really focus on violence until really modern time, very modern times. And I'm not here to embrace, say, a treatment of people who have been convicted of, quote, violent crimes as in a special way at all. But I do think that one of the lessons maybe, or one of the values that has come to the fore during the war on crime that the Black Lives Matter movement is radically reinterpreting for us is anti-violence. Because if the real value, if the real thing we want from public safety, what we call public safety, is protection of human dignity in its against its most challenging threats to the human body, to the human life, to the various things that we call violence, which is not an easy word to understand in its full ambit. What I hear coming from the Black Lives Matter movement loud and clear, and it's been coming from the feminist movement as well for some time, is that the current carceral legal system, even though it takes a great deal, if not all of its legitimacy from claiming to be against violence and about repressing violence, it actually does a terrible job of that. The fact that, you know, violent crime is the category where the police are supposedly the most effective, but they only supposedly clear something like half of all violent crimes and far lower numbers in segregated communities of color. And if you look at the history of the police, of the prison, none of them were really invented to deal with violent crime. They were designed to protect property. They were designed to control disorderly rabbles and that were gathering in the cities because of immigration in the eyes of the nativist populations, et cetera. They had various jobs to do, but repressing violence isn't one of them. And if you think about any of them, it's hard to see how they would stop violence. They're just not well calculated to do that. I mean, no disrespect to them in that regard. So it seems to me the irreducible minimum would say something like criminal legal institutions are only tolerable to the extent that they can effectively suppress violence better than any combination of alternative ways of governing that situation that we can find are, because we know that it's going to be inherently humiliating to lots of the people who encounter it. And to me, that suggests a pretty small minimum, although undoubtedly we could agree on some things. So one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about is generation and change. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement is a really exciting opportunity for this whole country. I mean, the last time we had a Black-led change in our values in the 60s, and remember, Black movements for liberation are always global. I mean, Du Bois said that the color line is the problem of the 20th century, and it's now the problem of the 21st century. Then it seems to me that, in many respects, the Black-led leadership of the movement in this country was taking its lead from the anti-colonial independence movements around the world and tried to fashion itself as a kind of revolutionary. When you watch Fred Hampton in The Black Judas and the Black Messiah, he's offering the Rainbow Coalition and then asking the audience to, are you a revolutionary? It's a little bit awkward. This is a different moment. And today, actually, the world is looking at the Black Lives Matter movement as maybe the leading expression of what a Black liberation movement today can look like. And I find that really promising for the fact that it can be durable and have affect lasting change. But I'm living in California, so that makes me optimistic. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, John. And we're going to move quickly to Aneka for her contribution from her blog, which is also very thought-provoking. Aneka.
Thank you. I may go a little off script from the blog just because I also want to acknowledge where I am just personally right now in this moment. And last night when we wrapped up our Square One Roundtable discussion with Marlon and Daryl, I looked at my news feed. I'm from North Carolina, and I saw where police killed another Black man. And as I think about Mr. Andrew Brown Jr. this afternoon, I'm sitting here today and I'm emotional. And it's okay for me to be emotional. And so I don't apologize if I cry this afternoon, because I really need to just grieve. I acknowledge the role that I played as a system actor in ultimately what impacted the sustainability of carceral systems. In 2015, when I was appointed warden, it was this like nuanced idea. Oh, a psychologist is a warden of a correctional institution. And a lot of people applauded that. And for me, it suggested that they recognized that something was missing in correctional institutions. And, you know, this notion, if you just get the right people in place, you can fill that gap. And for 11 and a half years in various positions working in correctional institutions, that's what I tried to do. I tried to fill a gap. And it was towards the end of my tenure that I realized that I believe, nor could anyone else fill the gap of humanity in that system. Don't get me wrong, like there were moments where myself and my team, we celebrated when an officer was fired for excessive use of force, when vile acts were caught on camera and we were able to sleep a little bit better because we removed that one person from this whole system of toxicity. We celebrated. But those moments were fleeting. And what was enduring was a fear that people had. It was an enduring disconnection from anything that affirmed the worth of people. It was an enduring inhumanity and intolerable conditions by which we forced people to live and commune. And there was no and is no enduring humanity or dignity in correctional institutions. And for that reason, I firmly believe in the abolition of this system because it causes immense damage to not just individuals, but families and communities. And in holding that belief, and in reflecting on last night's conversation with brothers Marlon and Daryl, I have asked myself, what do I believe should happen with individuals who act in some of the most egregious ways? And Marlon and Daryl described, that person as someone we wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. And I've looked these individuals in their eye. I've sat across from them. I've sat next to them, and I've pushed myself to see them beyond the behavior they were charged with. And in every case, not most, but every case, that person was a person that we as a community failed over and over again. And as I sit here today, I understand that the American correctional institution does nothing to correct that damage. It only multiplies it. And so what would I say should be done with a person who commits egregious acts, a person that we wouldn't want to see in a dark alley? And when I thought about Mr. Andrew Brown Jr., I said, I would want the same thing to be done to that person that I would want done for my children, for my boys, to provide unyielding support as they confront the harm that they've experienced and the harm that they've caused. And as they understand the connections between the two, and educating them on the ways they can turn their pain into some sort of promise, and preparing the community to receive them again. I'm angry with the officers who killed Mr. Andrew Brown Jr., but I also recognize that a lifetime in a carceral system is not going to bring Mr. Brown back, and it's not going to correct the damage that they've done. And so I do believe that we need a system of accountability because people will continue to cause harm. That's the reality of the world that we live in. But that new system has to be rooted in healing and safety. And that means healing and safety for everybody. And the 2 points that I want to end with are really sparked by my blog, but also sparked by the conversation we had last night with Marlon and Daryl. And in last night's conversation, we talked about some individuals being irredeemable. And as I reflected on that conversation and my experiences working in this system, I felt compelled to share my reflection that no person is irredeemable. No person is irredeemable. The system is. The system is irredeemable. And the last point that I'll make is that in order for us to uproot this system, we have to create space for practitioners and theorists of criminal justice reform and abolition to commune. And in that space, we have to acknowledge the harm that has been caused and is being caused, and we have to actively repair and renew our communities that are being harmed. And we have to truly map out how we are going to build this new system that is grounded in safety and healing, and we must do that together.
Aneka, I think I speak for all of us when I say that we're really moved by your honesty and your bravery, your own personal journey that you've traveled, and your reflection on your life and on the state of affairs in the country, and your willingness to bring that to this group today, and to provide that as a testimonial to the work ahead. It was really, really powerful and deeply impactful. We are in your debt. So thank you to you and to John and to Marcia. It's quite. Bruce yesterday said something about the magic of the Roundtable, and what we've just seen is the magic of the Roundtable and the way people can learn from each other, and to have a cumulative experience that is more than individual. It's also communal, and hopefully spreads beyond this screen to others as well. I'm just quite moved by what we just heard. We are going to continue this conversation wherever it takes us in our breakout rooms, and that'll happen soon with the miracle of Zoom. So you'll be in a pre-assigned room. There'll be people responsible for reporting out from your session. Catherine, Bruce, and I will be in each of us in one of the breakout sessions. For those of you who are watching this in real time as observers, we'll be Square One doesn't stop, so you'll be seeing some footage from earlier Square One events. So we hope you find them to be valuable and worthwhile. And then we'll come back after a break at 2 o'clock Eastern Time for a report out from the breakout session.